Hello students, this video is designed to help with the reteach lesson for Interim Assessment 1. We took a look at some of the questions that most students got wrong for the interim assessment and tried to explain how to do them. Then we gave you a couple of practice problems. Take a look at those practice problems now. If you haven't already done so, try these questions and then come back to see if you got them right. For the first question here, it asks us about 2 points, Angela's house and Kathy's house, and it gives them directions. If you didn't already do so, please try to label these as the cardinal directions. This is north, this is south, this is west, and hiding at the edge of my screen here is east. Come on back here, east. Anyway, we know that we're trying to plot these points, so we're using north, east, south, and west as the directions for plotting those points. You know that if you're doing 2 miles south and 5 miles west, that means 2 down and 5 to the left. Once you plot those points and you get coordinate points or coordinate pairs for those points, you're able to plug them into the distance formula. As I spoke about in class, this distance formula is probably one of the formulas for your dump sheet. You should go back home and memorize these and then come into class with them memorized, ready to write down on your test as soon as you get the test. Once you use the distance formula, you're able to substitute those numbers in and solve. In class, we had an example where we simplified a square root. However, the square root of 146 cannot be simplified. There are no perfect squares that factor into 146. So this is your final answer. We're going to say that the girls' houses are square root of 146 miles apart. You could put this into the calculator and get an answer. It's a little bit larger than 12. However, it does not ask for a decimal. It asks for simplest radical form, so we got to leave it like that. For the second question, it tells us about a high school and a library that are at different positions on the grid, and then it's asking us where the gymnasium is. It tells us the gymnasium is in between the high school and the library. It splits the segment HL into a ratio of 1:3. That means there's 1 piece up here and 3 pieces down here. Now that you're looking at the graph, it's probably pretty easy to identify where that gymnasium would be. If the point is here, there's 1 slope between there and 3 slopes between there and there. So that should be the 1:3 ratio. So your answer should be 3, 5. However, it says only an algebraic solution would be accepted, which means you must use algebra. Luckily for you, the algebra is pretty easy. This is the partition formula for the x values. This is the partition formula for the y values. Again, a very good candidate for your dump sheet. Substituting into the equation with a and b, we know that a is the first value in our ratio and b is the second value in our ratio. And then we're substituting the x values and y values respectively. This part is just algebra, so I'm not going to walk you through it. 3, 5 should be the location of the gymnasium. Anytime you get a question that gives you a ratio, something that says splits into, a number here and a number here, you should be using that partition formula. Take a look at the next page. This is the back of that first page. Pause the video, try these out, and then see if you got them right. All right, looking at this, we've annotated the problem. Just like any other problem, you must annotate it in order to try to break into it. It gives us the endpoints, x1, y1, x2, y2. It asks for the equation of the perpendicular bisector, and notice that we wrote down some notes, negative reciprocal for perpendicular bisector, and midpoint for bisector, I should say. First, we found the slope. This is another dump sheet formula that you should write down. The slope is y2 minus y1 over x2 minus x1. The midpoint is another dump sheet formula, but we'll get to that in a second. The slope is easy to find, but once you find that slope, you do need to change it into its negative reciprocal. We're using negative reciprocal slope because, as you wrote down here, perpendicular means it's going to have a negative reciprocal slope. They can't be the same exact slope because if it had the same exact slope, the lines would be parallel. The midpoint formula is very straightforward. Students sometimes get these pluses wrong. Students sometimes put minuses, but they must be pluses because what we're doing is finding the average of the 2 x values and the average of the 2 y values. That gets us a point that's directly in between. Don't panic if there's a decimal in here. When you divide by 2 and it's an odd number, of course, you're going to get a decimal, but that's the craziest decimal that you'll ever get in the midpoint formula because you're always dividing by 2. So here's your midpoint. Once you find the midpoint, you can substitute those values. This is the x value and this is the y value. That goes in here for x and y respectively. If you're wondering where this 3/2 comes from, that is the negative reciprocal slope that we found before. So once you solve this equation, you get the y-intercept. Again, it's a decimal, but don't freak out. Decimals are cool. They're people too. So your final answer, your final equation should be y equals 3/2 x. This 3/2 comes from the negative reciprocal slope that we found in the first step. And the y-intercept is negative 0.75, as found here. Next, we're looking for the measures of all interior angles of this triangle. We're given 2 angles here and here. We call these remote interior angles, and we're given an exterior angle, so we do use the exterior angle theorem. Once you do your algebra, you should get x is equal to 49. Then we're substituting that 49 into both of these different algebraic expressions for the angles here. X minus 4 becomes 49 minus 4, and 2x plus 10 becomes 2 times 49 plus 10, etc. and so forth. So this is 45 degrees, this angle here. This is 108, this angle here. Remember that the question is asking for the measures of all interior angles, which means if you know two angles and you need a third, you can use the triangle sum theorem to find that third. You can also use supplementary here. I know that this angle and this angle here are supplementary. They form a straight line. However, I didn't use that method. I used triangle sum theorem. You could feel free to use whatever you'd like. The next page is coming up here, questions 5 and 6. Pause the video, try these out by yourself, and then see if you get them right. All right, the question asks for what the relationship is between these two lines. In other words, what do they have in common? It gives us points, and instead of using the grid because it says the use of the set of axes is optional, I'm going to try to do this using algebra. If you'd like, if you're a more visual learner, you can plot these points. As a matter of fact, I'll plot them for you now. All right, you can see the points have been plotted here, and I connected them both in straight lines. Just by looking at the graph, it should be fairly straightforward to figure out what the relationship is between these two lines, but this question is asking us to prove it, in other words, justify your reasoning. So the best way that I can figure out to do that is by showing the algebra. The first line, we found the slope here, which is fairly straightforward, substituting in x and y, respectively. Then we find the y-intercept by substituting any of these 2 points into the equation y equals mx plus b, along with the slope. We find the equation is y equals 1x plus 0, or in other words, just y equals x. This next equation is y equals 1x minus 2, or in other words, x minus 2. I can tell that they have the same slope, and they have different y-intercepts. Since they have the same slope and different y-intercept, we can say that these lines are parallel. This did look like an algebraic question, and in truth, you do need algebra to figure this out, but really it's asking for a concept. It's asking for this vocabulary word, which is parallel. For question number 6, it says, using the diagram at right, find the values of x and y. We need to use our angle relationships here to try to figure these out. There are a couple of different ways to do this, but I think my favorite way is trying to use supplementary as much as I can until I have to use something that's more complicated. And it turns out that I don't have to here. Supplementary says that angle plus angle equals 180. Any 2 angles or 3 angles or 4 angles that make a straight line are equal to 180. And I can see that this angle here, which is 5x plus 45, and this angle here, which is 3x minus 25, they form a straight line. So those 2 angles add up to 180. I do the algebra here, and I get x equals 20. Then once I get the value of x, I can substitute that x value into all of the x's in the problem. That's what I did here. I got 145 for this angle, and 35 each for these 2 angles over here. So this angle's 35, and this angle's 35. That's not always going to be exactly the same. It just happens to end up like that in this question. Then the next thing I'm going to do is supplementary again. This time I have 1, 2, 3 angles that add up to 180 because these 3 angles form a straight line when you put them together. Keep in mind, anytime you got a straight line, add the angles that compose that line up and set them equal to 180. That's an easy way to do this. I'm substituting and solving, and I get y equals 110. So I have the 2 values of x and y. That's the thing I circled. I could find this angle if I wanted. I could find the measures of all the different angles if I wanted, but it doesn't ask me to do that, so I'm not going to. Don't give the graders too much information, because if you happen to give too much information and some of the information is wrong, they might mark you wrong. Moving on to the last page, questions 7 and 8. Pause the video and try these out if you haven't already done so, and then come back to see if you got them right. This question is a classic auxiliary line question. We call this an auxiliary line because it's an extra line that we draw on ourselves based on a certain criteria. In this case, this auxiliary line is parallel to the given lines A, B, and C, D. We know that A, B, and C, D are parallel because of these 2 markings, this arrow here and this arrow here, that indicates that they are parallel. So I'm saying, well, why don't I draw a line that's also parallel to AB and also parallel to CD? Once I do that, I can treat this line, EI, and this line, GE, as transversals. Once I do that, once I call them transversals, then I can start identifying angle relationships. For example, I know that this angle here and this angle here are going to be equal to each other. They're congruent to each other. Why? Because of alternate interior angles. I made that Z shape with these 2 lines. That means that angle 23 and angle A are exactly the same. The next thing I can do is identify consecutive interior angles. I know that angle B here and angle, well, it doesn't say here, so I'm going to name it EHD. This angle are consecutive interior angles. They're on the same side of this transversal. They're both on the top of the transversal. They're not down here at the bottom. And they're also between the two parallel lines. Since they're between those two parallel lines, we know that they are going to be interior. That's what we call them. If they were outside the parallel lines, we call them exterior. Anyway, consecutive interior angles do add up to 180. So we set these two angles equal to 180 and solve for the variable. Once you find those two numbers, you can tell that FEH, which is this big angle here, F to E to H, that's going to be equal to angle A plus angle B. That was the original angle that we had in the problem. We split the angle up using the auxiliary line, but we know that that aux line just splits it up into A and B. So we combine them back together, A and B, and we found A here, we found B here, so we were able to add them together and get 66 degrees. How great. Last question. This gives us some information. This might look familiar because this was a similar question to one that we did in another reteach lesson. You have these three angles that are given to you, so you had to label the diagram. I did that here in red. And then you're asked to find the measure of angle ACB, which is out here. I outlined it in green. We'll talk about that in a second. I know that this triangle here is comprised of these three interior angles, and I am given all three interior angles, which means I'm going to add them all up and equal them to 180 or set them equal to 180. I do some algebra here, la-di-da-di-da, and I get x is equal to 40. Once I get x is equal to 40, I'm able to use substitution to find all three angles, but I'm not going to bother doing that. I just want one of them. Once I find this angle, which is 55 degrees, I know that this angle and this angle have to be congruent to each other. Why? Vertical angles. Now keep in mind, as a student, you are expected not only to find the correct numerical answer, which is ACB is equal to 55, but you are expected to give the justification. If you do not give the justification, you will not receive full credit on these questions. Notice that in all the problems that I've done so far, I've given my justification at the top with a little underline or next to it in parentheses. So every time you answer a question, make sure you're given justifications for your reasoning, supplementary, substitution. I also have justifications here, finding the slope, midpoint, y-intercept, and equation. I also have justifications here, exterior angle theorem, triangle sum theorem, and substitution, respectively. All right, this was the video on the reteach lessons for interim assessment number 1. Good luck studying.